Welcome to Foreword, a TED's faculty podcast. I'm Madison Pierce.
And I'm James Arcadi.
In our episode for today, we're interviewing Dr. Tali Lau, who is Associate Professor of New Testament here at TEDS. Dr. Lau's first book, Politics of Peace, was published by Brill in 2009. And we're going to hear more about his most recent book, Defending Shame, which has been published with Baker Academic just this week, today. Dr. Lau was one of my professors here at TEDS, and so I know firsthand that he is a tremendous gift to our community. I can't wait for you to hear more.
And he is my next door neighbor, actually, in our offices at TEDS. And so I'm delighted to be able to have a conversation with him. And do stick around after the episode for a bit of a debriefing, you might say, or conversation on movies with Dr. Pierce and myself.
Tali, thank you so much for joining us today. First off, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and perhaps a little bit about your role on campus, some of the things you teach, maybe how long you've been around TEDS?
Well, I'm from Singapore. I grew up in Singapore, and then I came over to the United States for my college. I worked in the Silicon Valley for about 10 years, and then I came over to TEDS as a student myself. I did my MDiv, I did my THM here at TEDS. Then I went over to Emory University for my doctoral studies. And then after graduating, I came back to TEDS and teach. So I've been teaching at TEDS ever since 2008. So that makes it about 11 years, around 11 or 12 years for that.
That's great. What I'm just curious, what brought about this shift from working in Silicon Valley to going to seminary?
Well, it's quite a major shift, that because I worked in the Silicon Valley for about 10 years, and then certain events happened in my life that really questioned in terms of what did I want to do with my life. And there were certain pivotal events, for example, like a good friend of mine from Stanford had passed away from lymphoma, even at a very early age. Then my sister-in-law needed to have head surgery because of an acoustic neuroma. And I just remembered sitting in my office one day and asking, what am I doing here? And ultimately, what do I want to be remembered for? Wow. What do I want to be written on my epitaph? And I said that I thought about it, and I really wanted to basically have a legacy. And I really wanted to invest my life in something that I felt was of eternal significance. Prior to that, I was designing computers. And, for computers, the shelf life of a computer is really short. We spent 4 years designing computers, but after about 2 years, it's time for an upgrade. And another 2 years after that, it's time in the dumpster. So I just felt I really wanted to invest my life in something that had eternal significance.
That's wonderful. And so did you immediately know that would be teaching in the academy, or was there a period of kind of processing what that eternal significance might look like for you?
I think it was ultimately a jump ahead to go try to teach in the academy itself. And because I felt that I had the teaching gift for teaching itself, it was kind of validated by different people. And I was actually afraid of pastoral ministry, because it was very demanding, and I knew it was very demanding. And I thought that since God had given me for a teaching, I would then just apply myself to academic teaching. But that was the main thought. But I think that now, after teaching, I am actually more open to pastoral ministry now than I had when I first went in.
I'd love to hear a bit about that pastoral ministry you're doing now, but just kind of back on the history, on the bio there. Was it biblical studies and New Testament even that brought you into to going to TEDS or going to seminary and shifting out of Silicon Valley, or was it something other than specifically like New Testament or biblical studies, which is where you ended up?
It was fundamentally about New Testament studies that kind of pulled me in. And actually, when I made that shift, actually, it was a lot of my colleagues thought it was a little bit bizarre in terms of why I would be doing it, because this was a time where it was just before the dot-com bubble blew. So there was in 1998, and everybody was wanting to jump into the IPO bandwagon. So in Silicon Valley, everybody wanted to be part of a startup. And then once a startup, went public, then they will all become instant millionaires at a time. So, and I studied at Stanford, and that was a place where, if you take a look at the history, so many startups have come from Stanford alumni. Companies like Netflix, HP, Cisco, that even a company that I work for, that all basically came from people that were affiliated with startup. I remember that one of my friends, his TA was Jerry Yang. And Jerry Yang went on to found Yahoo, you see. And so it was just this crazy environment where everybody just wanted to basically be a part of a startup and then jump onto the IPO and then become instant millionaires. But I was wondering in terms of what kind of return on investment do I really want in my own life? And so I think that was one of the things that really brought me to question in terms of what I was doing with my life. There was actually some movies that came out that was somewhat pivotal. There was this movie that came out, Braveheart, came out during that year in 1998.
Sure.
And what does Mel Gibson say to the princess when he's imprisoned? Do you remember that?
I remember the scene. I don't remember what he says.
Yeah.
All men die, but not all men live.
Wow.
We all die, but we don't live to the full potential of who we are. And so I was thinking to myself, how am I living my life so that I live to the full potential that God has given me? In that year, another movie came out too, Forrest Gump.
Sure.
And what does Ma always say?
Life is like a box of chocolates.
You don't know what you're gonna get. And if we don't know what we're gonna get, then again, how do we live our lives, that in a way that really pleases God? So there was all these constellation of factors that kind of prodded me along to kind of make the jump. And to kind of move towards going into biblical studies and going into seminary.
I'm excited for the next commencement when you're going to have blue paint all over your face. That'll be fantastic.
That's excellent.
I haven't tried that yet.
Oh my goodness. Tilly, thank you so much. I mean, it's wonderful to hear some of these things about you. One of the things that was refreshing for me as I was reading your book, which we'll come to in a minute, was you just have so many popular culture references in there. I mean, within a few pages. I mean, contemporary music, movies, television, all of that. So are you a pretty consistent consumer of media?
I enjoy watching movies, that I enjoy. In fact, my favorite genre is action movies. I know it's kind of bizarre, but that's my favorite genre. And I enjoy it. And I like to watch it. And I think that after doing biblical studies, that our minds are just so tired. I just want to take a break from thinking. Nothing too intellectual, but just something that I could just enjoy and kind of refresh and relax. That's
amazing. This might bring us to a really important question. Tilly, do you think Die Hard is a Christmas movie?
It's always set in Christmas, yeah. But I don't know whether it's... I will watch it during Christmas, but I remember watching it the first time it came out.
That's awesome. Oh, great.
Just curious. One thing we've kind of talked about sometimes is where we're from and the places we've lived. And so you spent time at Stanford and Silicon Valley. So I lived in Redwood City for a summer, just up the road there from Palo Alto. Loved the area. Were there particular places or things that you liked about the Bay Area, liked living there, or things that you remember from that area?
Well, I love the Bay Area. The weather, it's awesome. The food, it's awesome. It's culturally rich. There's so many diverse communities there. And I used to live in Palo Alto, and I remember cycling to work in Mountain View. And as I'm cycling to work, I would pass by the marshlands. And so that was always a wonderful place for me to go. So lots of wonderful memories. Lots of wonderful memories there.
Yeah, for sure. I love that area. It's great.
That's wonderful. Tilly, let's shift a little bit and talk about your most recent book, which is Defending Shame. It is, just out. Is it this week with Baker Academic?
Yeah, it came out on April 21st, I think.
Okay. So yesterday, from when we're recording this.
Right.
Could you tell us a little bit about the project?
It's a project that that I try to take a look in terms of, because I noticed that Paul sometimes occasionally shames people.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, why is he doing that? And how does that fit into our culture, that especially a culture that is so averse to shame? I think that we live in a world, in a culture that has really fractured understanding of shame. On one segment, we have people that are very averse to shame in any form. But that on the other extreme, we see people who like to use shame, especially in terms of doxing, in terms of online shaming, or in terms of body shaming, or even in terms of honor killing in other parts of the world. So trying to find out, what does Scripture have to say about all of this?
So was it, you mentioned there, just noticing it in Paul. So was it seeing this theme in Paul that just led the curiosity, or was it seeing kind of identifying the cultural trends, or was it a little bit of both that kind of led you to this study?
I think it was kind of both, that the interest, actually, the genesis for the book actually came because I had to teach a class in the global theology class in the North Chicago Theological Institute. Mm-hmm. And it was a class that was ultimately trying to look at shame, or rather to look at shame, cultural context itself. How did those kind of cultural contexts, especially in the East Asian world itself, how did they understand shame, and how did they understand soteriology? So that kind of formed the genesis for this entire book project. And it just kind of spiraled on from there.
Mm-hmm. I think we'll come back around to some of the ways that your research intersects with some of those contemporary understandings of shame. But to get us kind of started, a lot has been written on honor shame. I'm sure that more will be written, and those are very good projects. But your book is a little bit different. You're trying to break that mold a little bit and kind of challenge that binary and defend shame. So why are you defending shame, Tali?
I think that shame, it's a necessary element. And the reason why it's a necessary element is that when shame is properly understood, it's able to help us in our moral formation. Now, one of those, the ways that they have done the honor shame models itself is probably understanding it in terms of shame as a value. My approach basically takes a look at shame as a moral emotion. So I address the aspect of shame as a value system, but I go a step a little bit further in understanding shame as a moral emotion. And if shame is a moral emotion, then in what way can it help us ultimately to be a better person? So the book is a little bit different from those honor shame studies in that it also deals with moral psychology. Basically, not in terms of how do we become a better person, what is the intersection of psychology and morality? Because if shame is an emotion itself, then ultimately how does emotions play a role in moral formation?
That's great. That's great. And I one thing I appreciated about the book as a systematician, as someone not just in the biblical studies guild, was the way that you drew from a diversity of sources, not just doing conceptual background in Greco-Roman and Jewish backgrounds, but also in your dipping into philosophy and contemporary psychology. Why was that important just in framing the book? Why was that important for you to bring those pieces into what could be taken as just a more narrowly focused biblical studies piece?
I think it's part of my own approach itself. I'm kind of an eclectic person. Eclectic thinker, so that ultimately the approach that I took was very interdisciplinary. It was very interdisciplinary, so ultimately I paid attention to the usual Greco-Roman, Jewish backgrounds, but then I also wanted to take a look at psychology too, because if it deals with emotions, I need to take a look at in terms of how do psychologists understand it. But one of the things, to take note of is that when moral formation is talked about in people like Aristotle, it is fundamentally moral formation and moral psychology too. So Aristotle has written a lot on moral psychology. Socrates has written, not Socrates himself, but Plato, writing about Socrates, has written a lot about in terms of moral psychology. So I wanted to take a look at that. And another interest of mine is in terms of Confucian thought, Chinese Confucian thought. And Mencius and Confucius had also written a lot on moral psychology. So I wanted to bring all of that into play, into conversation, and to ask different questions, by putting it in juxtaposition with one another. Can we learn something about it? And can we ask the right questions? It's an approach that maybe Jonathan Z. Smith kind of uses, that trying to look for similarities and differences and similarities, so that when you have two portraits that are similar but yet different, by putting them together, maybe they might reflect something that we have never seen before.
That's excellent.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
That brings us back to your discussion of Eastern thought. And I know in your first book, In Politics of Peace, that's in conversation with Confucianism. And then that's obviously something that you're bringing out here. Could you say a little bit more about why you've felt that that's a fruitful comparison? Why is that a recurring theme in your work?
Well, I guess I'm writing as an Asian and I'm writing as a Chinese scholar. And I don't think that kind of work has really been done well and has really been done fruitfully. And I know that Yeo Kyeong has done some of that work. And I wanted to build on that in terms of how can we come up with new ways to ask questions. Now, obviously, when I'm comparing that Paul or scripture with Confucian thought, I'm not talking about genealogy at all. But I'm kind of doing just kind of a cross-cultural comparison and basically asking how can the similarities and differences ask different questions of the text itself, so that we might maybe look at it with fresh lens and with fresh eyes. So that's kind of approach that I thought might be fruitful and might be interesting to pursue.
Could you maybe give us...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, James.
No, please. All right.
Would you mind giving us kind of the major similarity and then maybe a major difference, if it's possible to boil that down? What have you found to be most interesting in that?
I think that for Confucius, that there is this emphasis in terms of developing a sense of shame. And for Confucius itself, he would say that this sense of shame is a much more important virtue than even the virtue of filial piety, which we know is so important in Chinese culture itself. So for Confucius itself, this sense of shame is so fundamentally important. And I think that that's also similar to in terms of Paul. This sense of shame is important in that we do not do anything that would bring dishonor to others. So issues like in terms of Philippians 2, where we are to consider others better than ourselves, that it has that thought. But so that's a similarity between Confucius and Paul. But there is a difference in that in Chinese thought, it is a little bit hesitant about shaming others. It doesn't speak a lot about this. It doesn't address a lot about shaming others, that. But for Paul, he's a little bit more forceful in that. And I think that sometimes certain Confucian scholars will talk about the necessity to reprimand others. But it is usually always in the background of it. It's never brought to the fore. Not so much as what we see in Paul. So that will be a difference there.
Thank you, Tilly. That's great.
If I could follow up kind of on that point, I had another sort of framing question, but just thinking about this line of the comparison with Confucian thought, which I found was a really interesting section. I don't know much about that area, that realm of study, so it was fascinating. But I think one thing you were highlighting in that section of the book was that the kind of Confucian system of utilizing shame for moral formation works better in a more kind of community-focused, less individualistic sort of culture. And perhaps there are some dovetails with the cultures in which Paul was writing as well. But for the 21st century North American or 21st century Westerner, we're very much not in that kind of a communitarian, interdependent kind of society. So how might you see ways of applying some of these Pauline themes that may fit better in a communitarian environment in a more individualistic environment like our own 21st century Western environment, like my own Western 21st century environment?
Well, that's an excellent question, James. It's in terms of how can we take some of these ideas, that we have seen in other societies and bring it into the American context. But I think that in the American context here, even though we are generally considered to be individualistic, but yet I think that is a certain detriment. That is a certain detriment. And also within the church too, is that the church tends to be very fragmented. And maybe one of the ways that we can bring it is not to just bring in this concept of shame itself directly, without also paying attention to the communal aspect or the communitarian aspect. In that maybe we need to develop this sense of community first, this sense of belonging first, this sense of accountability to one another. And if we have this sense of accountability to one another, then it gives us the right. It gives us the right to speak into another person's life. And so it brings to mind again that if we try to shame others without this sense of communal belonging, then ultimately people will construe that, what are you? Who are you? You don't even know me. How can you speak into my life? That. And so they would construe any kind of rebuke as humiliation, that you are trying to humiliate me. You don't know who I am. So you have no right to speak into me. So I think that one of the things we need to develop is the sense of community, that sense of belonging to one another. And maybe breaking up the church needs to be formed small groups that are accountability groups with one another. So that ultimately groups of 10, groups of 15, groups of 20, and that ultimately that if we develop this bond itself, all right, then I think that we would have the right to speak into each other's life, and that any criticism will then be taken a little bit much more better than if it was offered by some anonymous person. So I think it is a critique. It's a critique of the American church in terms of how it's done, and that everybody's just living separate lives.
And if I might, that seems great, because that also provides a healthy corrective to the kinds of shaming that is present in the culture that you pointed to, whether it's online shaming or what have you. It's a very anonymous, non-relational use of shame. But what you're talking about is a much more relational, even a loving kind of utilization of this tool of moral formation.
Yeah, that's absolutely. And I think that at least one of the things that I hoped that will come out of this book, is to realize that we as a body, we are part of the body of Christ, but we are a body within the church too. And if we are a body of the church, if one part is hurting, if one part is disease, the whole body suffers. And so we have a responsibility to one another, a responsibility to love, but sometimes a responsibility to say hard things to one another. And that, I think, is something that I wish the church would be able to recover.
Absolutely. James, did you have another question you wanted to throw in?
A little more on a framing question, but if you wanted to think more about this particular theme, that's fine with me.
No, go ahead. We'll shift into a conversation about ministry shortly. So if there's anything else about,
that's great. I guess I was just thanks for that. Maybe Laura on the framing and kind of back to the eclectic nature that you see yourself as operating within. And maybe the answer to this question is just simply you don't want to draw these hard and fast lines. But I was kind of curious on the relationship between biblical studies and systematic theology, and whether you saw, this book, from what I saw, is categorized in the New Testament section of Baker. And yet there seems to be very theological as well. So do you see that demarcation as helpful, or do you see this book as just blurring those lines between New Testament and an ST, let's say?
I think, it's helpful to kind of merge the two together. And I think that once we've gotten the whole idea in terms of Paul, how can we construct a certain theology of shame from Paul itself? And I think that construct the contextual aspect, I think it's helpful because it helps to pull all the data together and try to synthesize it. Now, when you synthesize something, possibly you could be a little bit reductionistic, all right? But I think that sometimes it's helpful to try to create a synthetical, even from the disparate data. And I think that that tries to force us to understand the data as much as possible. So I prefer to work as not really as a systematic theologian like you, but in terms of basically how would Paul, as a theologian himself, as a moral philosopher, how would he think about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. That sounds really attractive to me.
Yeah. Transitioning a little bit into more about how you kind of understand this research going forward. I mean, you've certainly highlighted some of the ways that this can influence our conception of ecclesiology, for example. I'm curious, in your cultural engagement section, the two of the places where you talked about shame being really influential are parenting and rehabilitation for
criminals.
And I'm certainly avoiding any jokes about how those two things may or may not be similar, but there must be a common thread. So why are those some of the areas, and why are other areas places that our society or that societies have found a positive place for shame?
I think that one of the things, that a lot of what I pulled off is from the work of John Braithwaite, who is one of the premier criminologists in Australia. And he basically is dealing with people who have done something bad. And ultimately, how do we then correct people who have done something bad? And he is then suggesting a way that if you just lock them up, they may have paid the price, but you haven't really reformed them at all. So that if there's no acknowledgement of anything that is wrong, then ultimately the wrong will still continue to be perpetuated. So that he talks about how there's a necessity for these delinquents itself to acknowledge the wrong that they have done. And through the acknowledgement of the wrong that they have done, how can there be reconciliation between the offender and the offended? So that instead of just paying the penalty itself, but this aspect in terms of admitting that we have done wrong and trying to form reconciliation, it's part of what is now called the restorative justice framework, which I think is powerful itself, that ultimately how can we try to, I think, to recover or to rehabilitate the situation and to create something meaningful or good out of something that is bad. So I think that that's part of the parcel of the work in terms of why I've drawn upon John Braithwaite's work in terms of criminologists, because he's helpful in that he distinguished between two types of shaming, between stigmatizing shame or destructive shame, and between reintegrative shaming, which serves to try to reintegrate the person back into the community. So I think that model, between stigmatizing shame or disintegrative shame and reintegrative shaming, that is kind of helpful. So that has been good.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the conversations that we have. I mean, you draw on this in the book that the excommunication or so-called excommunication of believers, that there needs to be a restorative function for those who are being cast out, and that's pretty clear in the text. That Paul says, hand this person over so that they might be saved. And so I can certainly see where that would be the case.
Or even in 2 Corinthians, where he says that the punishment that's done by the majority is sufficient. And now you have to welcome him, ultimately. You have to welcome him back into the fold. And that's model, that of giving somebody a timeout, all right? But then, because it's a timeout, it's limited. And you embrace the person back into the community. This model is actually done in tribal groups in New Zealand. It's done in tribal groups in Africa. And John Braithwaite actually got his idea actually from the tribal groups, the Maori groups in New Zealand itself. And you see, in the tribal groups, you can't just lock somebody up forever. They are still part of the community, but how then do you discipline the person? But then what do you do with the person? If you kick him out, he can't survive. There's nowhere else to go. So that you give a timeout, but then you have steps that will gradually bring the person back together into the fold. And I think that is a helpful model.
That's great, Lee.
Yeah, that sounds really great. In terms of thinking about how this could or will play out in the church, I mean, I know you do a fair amount of ministry and preaching and the like as well. I guess what's your hope for how these kinds of thoughts from Paul might be incorporated into churches in the future?
I think it would be helpful to incorporate in the churches in the future in terms of understanding at least firstly, what are the basis for honor and shame? And that the basis for honor and shame ultimately is not determined by society's values or what society considers to be honorable and shameful, but ultimately by what God considers to be honorable and shameful. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the church then is supposed to be the earthly analog of the divine court of opinion. The church must reflect the values of what is considered honorable and what is considered shameful, that God ultimately deems to be honorable and shameful. So the earth, or rather the church, is the earthly analog in terms of what the divine court of opinion should be. And the other thing too, I think that's also helpful for the church is that in terms of understanding the gospel, in terms of honor and shame categories, rather than in guilt categories itself. And so that will be a helpful way of, in fact, Sam Chan, who studied at Trinity, he wrote out a book in terms of how to make the gospel unbelievable, good use of the gospel believable. And he said that the Western world is actually much more receptive to understanding sin in shame categories rather than guilt categories. That the Western world today is much more receptive to understanding sin in shame categories rather than guilt categories, because we all feel shame so viscerally. Everybody experiences shame. But if you ask people whether they experience guilt, some people say no. But shame is something that is experienced so viscerally. And so that becomes kind of an entree or a place in which we can then talk about how sin is dishonoring God. And as we dishonor God, we ultimately are dishonored ourselves. Yeah.
Could you maybe tease it out a little bit more, like in terms of how do we understand the gospel in that honor shame category?
I think that you see that in Romans, that Romans 1 and 2 itself, in terms of what is sin. Sin is that not acknowledging God as God and not giving thanks to Him. So that sin ultimately is this sense of dishonoring God. And because of this sin, we are then shamed accordingly. And part of righteousness would then be to recover the honor that we were actually created for. God created Adam to be image bearers, and through that bearing of the image of God, they are to bear the glory of God in a reflected sense. So that righteousness is then seen in how we recover the glory that God had intended for humanity.
That's a lovely maybe even modification of an Anselmian view, or in the Anselmian view of the atonement is very much on God's honor. You're talking even about human honor as a component of this picture of what the gospel does in order to restore humanity.
Right.
That's beautiful, Tuli. I would really love to continue to hear more. Thankfully, we do have the opportunity to hear more from your book. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's really been a pleasure. I always enjoy learning more about you, so thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about this topic.
Yeah, thanks very much.
But that's just the foreword. You can learn more about Tuli's life and ministry via his faculty page on the TEDS website and by picking up his most recent book, Defending Shame, from the Baker Academic website. Thank you very much to Dr. Tuli Lau for being with us today. Thanks to our fabulous producer, Curtis Pierce, and our amazing graduate assistant, Lauren Januzek. Finally, thanks to all of you for listening along with us. I'm Madison Pierce.
And I'm James Arcadi.
James, we talked a lot about movies today. So what is your favorite action movie?
So I actually have a place in my heart for Braveheart, which is the movie that Tali mentioned. So it was that 98 when he said that it came out?
I think so, yeah.
That sounds roughly about right. Maybe, yeah, around then, because that was right around when I was in high school, and my church, being a Southern California youth group, had an annual movie competition where, now of course this was 90s, so like movies were not like, you couldn't just make a movie like by flipping out your iPhone or whatever. Like you actually had to like get a camcorder or all those old school things that we used to have.
Camcorder?
Yes, camcorder. That was, I know, Stone Age style home movies. And so my friends and I in our youth group did a parody spoof comedy version of Braveheart, complete with kilts, and we actually won an award in our youth group for Braveheart. So Braveheart, very close to my heart. How about yourself?
That's fantastic. I won't reveal my favorite movie right now because I'd love to chat a little bit more about Braveheart, which is certainly up there for me. But we, one of our favorite places to go is Sterling.
Yes.
And the Wallace Monument to, the actual William Wallace is there. But that's one of the places that Curtis and I joke that we're going to retire there someday. We're going to hold up in this little B&B that we love and just hang out in Sterling. So if you can't find us someday, we're probably in Sterling.
I've been there. So actually, when I was an undergrad, I did a study abroad semester in England, but we did a weekend trip up to Scotland and did some of the sites. And so have been to Sterling and climbed up the tower and saw the statue and all that stuff. So it's a cool place. And a good movie.
That's fantastic. Oh, yeah. It is. It's excellent. I talk about Braveheart whenever I teach on 1 Corinthians, because I think that freedom is the aim for most of the Corinthians.
Yeah, that's good. Do you yell that out in a real guttural sound?
I do. I also I threaten the students that I will tell this, or I will say the speech from Braveheart. If they don't behave themselves. So, which they immediately start acting out for some reason. I think they want me to make a fool of myself, but...
You should brandish a giant sword next time you come to class. Or as I said with with Tali there, some blue paint on the face during the class session. I think that would really, get people's attention.
I can't wait. Well, we have something to look forward to.
I think actually when I was doing that, I remember recalling, I think I actually had long hair at the time. So maybe you don't know that about me, but in high school, I had, hair down to my shoulder, maybe a little bit past my shoulders. So I had, I was kind of getting the full effect there to match the kilt and the sword and all that stuff. And I don't know if this video were made nowadays, it'd be on YouTube somewhere, but it probably just exists on some VHS at one of my old buddies' houses somewhere.
Oh, man. If only we could see it. We've got lots more things to learn about you, James. We also need to, at some point, talk about your punk rock phase, but we'll save that for another episode. We'll tease that for a later date.
Am I that mysterious? I don't
I feel, I know, you know what? Yeah, you're mysterious, James. You're a man of mystery.
Ooh. Do you know what's in this cup? It's mysterious. It's actually just water.
I was going to say tea, but water is even more, it's more boring.
More boring, yeah. The reality is actually often.
Oh my goodness.
But so you didn't say anything about your favorite movie or favorite action movie. Did you want to share that, or do you want to keep that a mystery? Maybe you're being the mysterious one now.
I really don't know that I have a favorite action movie. I mean, Die Hard is pretty far up there for me. I mean, we love Die Hard, and we do actually watch it on Christmas Eve.
Classic.
Just as a kind of silly thing. Because, I mean, for years and years, it was just the two of us, Curtis and I. And so we were able to have like a pretty low-key holiday. And in the midst of, more kind of jovial, like children's movies and all of that, sometimes it's nice to kind of mix in a little bit of Bruce Willis walking on glass and
a non-jovial, non-children's movie.
Yeah. Exactly. So, anyways, thank you all so much for being with us. It's wonderful to chat, and this is our last interview for the season, James.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Time
we've got a couple.
Do you remember when we started this? Remember when we started this and we were like in the same room together?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Things have changed quite a bit.
Well, stay tuned for the next season. We'll see what's going on in the world then.